Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching the Weaviate Podcast. We have a super exciting episode. I'm so excited to welcome Emil and Finn. They're building Kapa AI. Kapa AI is it's a super impressive kind of like large language model with vector database for your own code documentation, blog posts, this kind of thing. And personally, it saved my life. We have it in our Weaviate chat, and I needed to say, hey, how do I insert objects one by one with JavaScript? I asked Kappa. It's like, I got you. Correct answer. So I am so impressed with the system, and I'm so excited to be talking to Emil and Finn to hear about like how you to think about the evolution of this space. So firstly, guys, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
No, thank you. Awesome.
Thanks for inviting us.
Awesome. So could we kick this off maybe just like with the origin story of Kappa, like how you came to be working on this?
Yeah, for sure. Happy to give a quick rundown. Maybe by brief intro, I'm Emil, Finn over here. We go back about 6-7 years, met while doing university, initially studying finance, kind of looked at each other and said like, maybe this world is not for us. Then actually jumped ship and went to a postgrad in computer science and kind of did a lot of tinkering back in the day, tried to get a lot of little side hustles off the ground and so on. Eventually, that wasn't the time, sort of 6 years ago after the postgrad. So instead went our separate ways. I was a consultant for a couple of years. Finn worked as a software engineer. And then I think last year we kind of started looking at each other and like, man, there's a lot of stuff happening in this space. We were trying to fine tune our own GPT-2 models when that was a thing back in the day. And both of us, have a lot of friends that run like developer facing companies. So we just kind of like naturally began narrowing in on this problem space, which for us now is really just helping developers use software products. And I guess, yeah.
Yeah, amazing. And I really want to get more. I think you'll have such an interesting perspective on this kind of fine-tuning models and how people think about having their own custom large language models is a topic I really want to explore. But firstly, I have this question about, when you have a new company like Weaviate, for example, that you've gotten to Kappa, how are you thinking about like, how fast can I get the documentation code base? Like, how do I get all this into these systems as fast as possible, sort of?
Right. So maybe at the moment it takes us about like a day or two, depending on how much like the backlog is. So we've found so far, like, because this tech is super new and everybody is still a little bit like uncertain what it can do and how it works, you kind of need like a very white glove approach to this. So like, we're not really doing this like on a self-serve basis at the moment. So we just ask the companies, okay, what are your relevant sources? Like what should your bot know about? And then we kind of do it for them at the moment and hold their hand until it is in production. Just because it's so new and nobody really knows how to work, like how well it works, what it can do, what it can't do. And we can talk about like how we ingest it if that's interesting.
Yeah, I'd love to dive into that topic. I mean, I can maybe speak a little bit to, I've been trying to take this podcast and put it into Weaviate. And so I put it into Whisper, and I think white glove I interpret as meaning like manual cleaning still needed. So like I get the transcripts and specific terms, like if we start talking about like the LoRA paper, the low rank adaptation, like that particular word, it'll probably translate LoRA to like LAURA, the name, rather than LORA. Like, so these little things is what I'm finding. So, yeah, data ingestion. This is I really want to pick your brain about this. Like, how much manual effort is still needed? Are you excited about things like, unstructured, the LangChain kind of PDF parsing thing? Like, how are you thinking about data ingestion to these kind of systems?
I think sort of all general experience so far has been like, it would be great if you wouldn't have to do sort of any cleaning on the data. Like, if you could just build a full self-service that works automatically and you don't have to touch it at all, and it's very simple, that'd be great. And we've seen like quite a few people or like projects doing that. It tends to not work that well because you get a ton of things in there like that mess with the performance and down the line. So you do have to like if you can get to a very clean state in the beginning, it'll work so much better in the end. That's also how we've implemented is like try and get to the cleanest version, correctest version of the data before you ingest it into the system like this.
Yeah, so maybe graduating from once we get the text from whether it's like a web scrape and we got to kind of get the HTML tags out or, PDF parsing, and we might have some funky way it read like a 2-column layout or something like that. So once you have the text, how are you thinking about chunking it into atomic units and kind of having a symbolic structure around it? Or maybe those are two separate questions. Let's maybe chunking first.
Maybe like even like one step before that would be like, how do you even get to like a clean representation? Because so for us, like like every company has like a lot of different sources that you would input. It's not usually just the docs, but you have like different pages for the docs, tutorials, like discourse forums, GitHub issues, and they tend to all have like different structures for every company. So you do need some type of like general approach to doing this. So which for us means that the like web scraping at the moment, like having like a framework that can generally handle all kinds of pages. So that's sort of the first part, to be able to even get everything. And then the second step, you can think about like cleaning, chunking. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really, I think a lot about like sort of mimicking the system you've built with our Weaviate content and how that would look. I think about like just like the symbolic filters where I'd have like where title equals blog post title, and then I like, whatever it is, and then I keep that with each of the chunks. Yeah, so it's really interesting just like how you're parsing out the symbolic structure of someone's documentation. I imagine I really want to dive into how you do. You mentioned the Discord. Can you tell me a little more about how you mine out like Discord Slack conversations and add it to this kind of retrieval system?
Yeah, happy to maybe jump in here as well. I think maybe as sort of a general theme, what Finn and I are slowly discovering as we're building out Kappa is that, and this maybe speaks to the broader nature of like, where does, types of applications like Kappa sit in the ecosystem, right? Is that there's so many of these like, bits of niche information that are specific to a vertical. We're very much in the developer facing space, right? So that means like going out and talking to 10 of your customers to understand, well, how do you view your discourse forum, right? Okay, you have a certain number of people that reply. That means, okay, when it's someone from the moderator team, we should probably ingest that into Kappa. Do we ingest the full thread, or do we just ingest the question answer pair? And the only reason, like the only way you would ever discover this is by going out and having a lot of these conversations. And that's what we've done for, by now, I think a whole breadth of different technical documentation sources, be that Slack or Discourse or GitHub issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Maybe for Slack,
or
maybe for Slack specifically, like every company tends to have a slightly different opinion on how their Slack should be ingested. So we make like we've kind of a bit of a configurable framework to tailor it to like each company. And in the case of Slack, like what's good is that everything is already in threads. So every time somebody asks a question, somebody replied, it creates a thread. And then, for example, what we do, like one company might do, like, okay, take all the threads of the last year, only take threads where someone from a sort of whitelisted amount of people replied, or like from a team or specific people, drop all the other messages, and then take that sort of as a question answer pair. That's sort of like you need to get to some sort of non-noisy representation where you can be sort of sure that nobody has said something wrong. Because you might have a thread where somebody asks a question, then there's like two community members that say something wrong, and at the end you have someone from the team that actually gives the correct answer. And if you take all of that, you're just going to confuse your bot. So you need to, again, back to like cleaning and getting like a non-noisy representation.
Yeah, that's such an interesting nugget of how you do this. I mean, I kind of had two ideas, like thinking firstly, maybe like, whether it's just a classifier to run cheaply or it's a language model prompted like this to say like, do you think the original answer asker is happy with this answer and doing some filtering like that. The whitelist thing, very interesting. The academic in me who, I love the idea of kind of benchmarking these systems so that you can sort of ablate the models. And I can't wait to talk to you about the models, but like, do you maybe like take 50 of these threads and then have some system of, replacing maybe the whitelisted person with the language model. And then from there, you get some sense of how well Kappa works. Like, is there some kind of like, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, have you thought about this kind of like, using like these abstractive question answering, abstractive summarization metrics like Rouge, Blue scores on these kind of bootstrapped examples of conversation threads where say I'm on the whitelist and you replace Connor with Kappa, and then you say, here is the comparison of the final answer.
So far we've just used the data as is, to keep it like, so you can go to the customer and tell them like, hey, this is exactly like what's going to be in there. Like there's not going to be anything generated you don't control. So the company actually knows, okay, we only have this set of information, because they tend to get a little like skittish if you start to generate some things and so on. Like it kind of slips their control a little bit. And you might introduce some sort of wrong things and some like something hallucinated that shouldn't be there. So the moment it's just like, I'm sure some of these things would work quite well.
Mhm.
At the moment, we're not doing it. One thing we're probably going to do is like generate a title, where you could go like, hey, here was because Slack-thread doesn't have like a summary title. But you could generate one off the conversation saying like, okay, this was what this was about. That would probably help.
Yeah, I just saw Jerry and Llama Index tweeting about their like summary index, where you summarize long things, and yeah, it's such a cool idea, and yeah, really cool for Slack. I guess before transitioning to the hallucination problem, which I think is such a big topic for this application, I guess the question I really want to ask and get your experience with building this thing out is like, how do you tell Weaviate or whoever like how good Kappa is? Like, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a super good question. I mean, the short answer is, the potential accuracy threshold of an application like Kappa really also varies across projects, right? You might be lucky and be dealing with a company like Weaviate that has fantastic docs, like deep set of technical tutorials, threads. No, it's serious here, right? And for which you can actually get a bot that can be quite performant. And then there are other times where, a company think they might have sort of great docs, if you will, but then actually when it comes down to it, there's a lot of sort of holes. So the short answer is it's really just, again, having conversations with the customers, trying to understand like, average accuracy metrics based on sort of thumbs up, thumbs down, that helps kind of proxy that. And then also just sort of setting expectations for where the tech is today.
Yeah, and I know from my experience using Kappa, I've seen the thumbs up, thumbs down, and that it will be. Well, I want to park that because I want to come back
Yeah.
into this idea of owning your own language model and how you could bootstrap data that way. But let's hit the hallucinations thing because naturally, I think the biggest thing is yeah. How are you thinking about hallucinations right now?
I mean, I think the short answer is it's probably the thing we've historically thought the most about. I can name countless of experiments, conversations with academics, like scanning through the latest archive papers, like trying to figure out like how can we bring down hallucinations. And there's probably not an approach we haven't tried. But to be honest, as these models are getting more powerful, for example, upgrading from our case, we run on OpenAI as our last sort of off the shelf generation model. Just making that bump up from sort of DaVinci 003 to GPT-4 already helps address a lot of that. And then in addition, we think a lot about sort of nudging Kappa to always produce an uncertain answer as opposed to a sort of a potentially creative answer, which means today hallucination is not really a problem we deal with in production.
Fascinating. So the current state of just kind of prompting it like, please ground your answer in this context, and then just please don't make anything up in all capital letters or something like that. just that alone seems to be strong with the strong morals. But so I guess my question with that, well, it comes into the transitioning topic of I'm very curious about how you think about the large language models because so the running GPT for every query, I imagine, is kind of expensive. So are you interested in the open source models like Llama, GPT-4, like the Mosaic MPT, these kind of trends? And then, but then did they not have this like then you have to rethink about hallucination?
I mean, the short answer here is incredibly excited about the potential. I mean, for one, from a cost perspective and potentially latency down the line, right? But also very excited because, I mean, one of the common concerns, right, you hear when deploying these models in production is, ownership of data and transferring and so on. So I would love to be able to offer Kappa on-prem as a service, which would be possible down the line with something like an open source Llama, etc. But right now, honestly, it's not something we spend a lot of time thinking about, just because the whole focus is really, a slower but better answer is usually preferred.
And you're very right. Like it's quite expensive at this point, which means from an economic perspective, like some much larger context windows aren't necessarily feasible for this use case. Because you have to look at it, okay, like how much is one question answered or one generation worth in sort of the economic terms for like your customer? And can I even use something like a 32K like context window? Like, does it make sense? And for us, like at the moment, it's okay, like cost is fine, but like for example, using like 30K context window we couldn't sell that most likely.
Fascinating. I mean, I think, so I think the GPT-4 32K, and then I suspect that the Anthropic 100K, that both work with like this API thing. I suspect that, yes, both those are quite expensive. But I'm so excited about this Mosaic's 65 billion parameter. I think it's 7 billion. 65,000 input window is something you can run in transformers. I think basically the way they're doing this is that they call it alibi attention, and it's kind of like the newest sparse attention variant, where sparse attention is you never have that like dense matrix multiplication where you multiply 65,000 by 65, and create these gigantic matrices that obviously can't fit on a single GPU and the whole problem. But with those kind of models, it makes me think that maybe they can cheaply run it. I don't know too much about it, but the question I really want to ask you about with these long input length models is like with retrieval, and obviously you're working on aggregating all these information sources for companies like Weaviate, documentation, code base, blog posts, code examples, this podcast maybe, right? So like, do you think packing the prompt as densely as possible would be the future of that?
I mean, maybe at some point, but right now, for sure not. I mean, you really like if like what you want to get is like the smallest amount of relevant context to answer the question. Like that's ideal, right? So that's where you get the least hallucination, the most crisp answer. You can fit a lot more into the context window than we're doing right now. It wouldn't make it more expensive, and it wouldn't necessarily improve the answer or make it worse. Maybe at some point it's so good, but right now and in the foreseeable future, I think you definitely want this retrieval step to give you like the relevant context. I mean, the more irrelevant things you add, the worse your answer gets.
Hey everyone, sorry, we had a little bit of a recording, a little bit of a connection issue, but we're back. So when we left off, we were talking about these kind of long input length models and the trends in that. And I think actually it would be great to kind of pivot into this next conversation, which is the trends in fine-tuning your own large language model, which is we're seeing with LoRA, LoRA, the low rank adaptation. It's like a trend in the sparse fine-tuning where now you can fine-tune like a 7 billion parameter model for like $20. Or I don't know about 20, I think I've seen like $100 is arbitrarily, obviously depends on the size of the model and how long you're going to train it for. But so how do you think this will change everything, fine-tuning language models? Are companies going to want to own their own language model?
I think, and I'm just speaking anecdotally here, also with conversations with other founders in the space, I think fine-tuning has a lot of promise, and where fine-tuning can really deliver value to folks in the real world is very much stylistically in terms of the types of answers it generates. But if you're thinking about fine-tuning from a like accurate knowledge retrieval step, I think you'd still run into a ton of hallucination problems. At least anecdotally speaking, when we've done countless of fine-tuning experiments, and it's really you just run into hallucination, as opposed to having like I think Sam Altman had a tweet a couple of months ago saying like talking about some new OpenAI pricing, and his tweet was something like, I think most people would be happy to pay like $2 for 1,000 tokens, but 1,000 really high quality tokens. And I think that still holds true. Also from, I would say, our perspective, meaning I'd much rather have a great off the shelf, high accuracy, high reasonability off the shelf model.
Maybe just to add to that, like from what we've seen, like we had 2 customers so far that like in the past, like sort of before, like sort of last year, took a bunch of their support tickets. So like some of them had like 3,000 emails, for example, going back and forth, and fine-tuned their own, like, I guess, like what was available. Like I forget what exactly they fine-tuned, but they had sort of what Kappa is now themselves, but purely fine-tuned without any retrieval, and used that to like generate answers to support tickets. And now I've moved off that and just use us. And then like we basically took the same data they used to fine tune, put it into their bot, and it like just anecdotally to them it works better this way.
Yeah, fascinating. I think working on a vector database, I think you might expect that my reaction to this news is just like, thumbs up all the way.
Yeah.
But I don't think these two classes of algorithms, like approaches, have to conflict like this. Like, I think you can still have a retrieval augmented generation with a fine-tuned model, and
Yeah.
you still have the benefit of it kind of can cite its sources a little bit. You can update the information base. So I would start by saying I don't see these as two like different things. Like if the LoRA algorithm is successful, that means end of vector databases and all that kind of thing. But yeah, I think something fascinating about it is like there's this like robustness, like this general language understanding that comes from these large models with how they've been pre-trained. And I do think like if you fine tune it, you might lose that kind of robust, like as you mentioned, like the hallucination problem becomes more so. And we've seen that like crazy with there's a lot of experiments like Clip. There's this paper called Wise FT where they show that like, if you just fine tune Clip, you lose like the robustness of it. And it's really interesting. Yeah. I mean, the idea of fine tuning on support tickets. I mean, have you ever when I've talked to I've talked to Jonathan Frankel on the podcast about Mosaic ML's philosophy with owning your own language model. And it's like, have you seen someone who has just so much text data that you would pre-train the language model on it? And so it's not even like fine tuning. It's like the language modeling objective is done with this data set.
I mean, maybe the biggest we've seen so far, like you never really get it like past like a 2,000-3,000 pages of text, sort of like loosely speaking. Nobody has like an insane amount of valuable data for like their specific. I mean, like the best case scenario would be somebody has like really, really extensive docs and like API reference, then has a ton of like good GitHub issues, a very like big discourse forum, and then maybe like their past Slack conversations. But even with like, if that all is really big, you don't really get past like 3,000 pages of text or something like that.
Yeah, that's really fascinating because it makes me think like good documentation should be sort of compact, I suppose. Like, right. Like it's also, I mean, it's so interesting. Like, should companies be trying to create as much digital content as possible in this world, or should they be like have a really refined, compact documentation? Or they're like two things you mix, right? Like you have the source of truth, highly curated, and then like, this podcast, how we just fire it on and just start talking and creating content, like two kinds of content.
I mean, for some, like we sometimes debate this with the blogs of companies, because some of these are like technical tutorials almost how to do something, and that's relevant probably to developers. But also some companies write a lot of blogs for sort of SEO optimization. It's just sort of some general news which is like loosely related to them, and that's not necessarily super valuable for your like QA bot. It has to be like really, really high quality text. I mean, one interesting thing regarding that as well is that so you will have a lot of relevant, okay, companies will have like a lot of technical documentation around their product, but to understand that you still need a lot of other like more fundamental understanding of things, of like programming and like other frameworks and operating systems. And if you take all that away, like then their technical documentation really doesn't make much sense. So you need some like model that understands sort of all the context beneath what their product is about.
Fascinating. I mean, especially it's like, I think there are two things to this. It's like the GPT-4 already knows Python and JavaScript, so you don't need to go get the Python documentation and retrieve from that. But then it's like, say like with Weaviate, like if we integrate with LangChain, and then like LangChain is continually evolving such that the large language models can't keep up. So have you ever thought about advising someone to grab the documentation of like another library that they integrate with closely?
We have a few of those customers. Like React, this has been like kind of a good example of that. So a lot of front end frameworks, a lot of like things that interact with React. For some of them, we've put it in like as well. There's a little bit the like bit of a business question of, well, do I want my bot to know like that well about this other framework? Because their documentation will contain also some like, oh, how great is React on its own and things like this. And it might lead a little bit away from their product. So it's a bit of it's kind of like a case by case decision if you put it in or not, if it's like valuable. I think so far it's been kind of successful for a few people.
Yeah, fascinating. I think that's something that even humans, like as we create content, we need to think about. It's not even just the language models. Like, am I just advising you to use LangChain instead of the Weaviate generate module? Just like as a little thing to hit at. But okay, so the next topic I really want to ask you about is at Weaviate, we're curious about this concept that we're calling generative feedback loops to describe when the language model transforms the data in some way, like maybe write like the summarization is one example. Like, how do you think about transforming data and then saving it to further help with the retrieval?
I think that's a really interesting area. And to be honest, we haven't really explored a lot of generative steps at the retrieval stage. I think it's one, like I see Jerry from Llama Index tweeting out a bunch of stuff on this topic, right? So it is a really interesting thing that probably could help with retrieval. But maybe just one general observation is, I think when working in this space, right, we're always very quick to quickly throw like a language model at a problem. Like, oh, great, maybe we can summarize something here, maybe we can do something here. And I think that the general observation is, it kind of rarely works very, very, very well, because by every step you introduce like another GPT call, or every step you introduce one more thing, you have to build a ton of guardrails to ensure you have a stable system to handle edge cases, etc. So it's a lot of the time when sort of thinking about, you have to really zoom out and think about systems design as you're introducing one more layer of noise. That being said, I think this is probably a stage that is definitely worth exploring further.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I think like it's like the large language model overkill solution is a potential. Like, I can say just from my experience of like, I have 477 podcast clips in this podcast search data set that you guys will soon be a part of. And, and as I summarize each of these clips, that cost me about $4 to do 477. So, and it linearly scales, of course, like that kind of thing. So yeah, like I saw Jerry, one of the newer ideas is use the large language model to truncate the search results. So say you get, 10 search results, the language model says only take the first 3 and then to the next step. And I think that might be an overkill intermediate. It's like also using it for re-ranking.
I think we had something like that in the beginning, which didn't kept throwing out really relevant things, and then we got rid of it.
Awesome.
No, go ahead, Connor.
Okay. I was going to ask, kind of wrapping up the podcast, this has been a great coverage of just how you think about companies getting all of the, particularly software companies getting all of their content into these systems, thoughts on the trends and longer inputs, and then fine tuning, and then just generally thinking about how you think about your content, all of these topics. I want to ask kind of an open-ended question of what topics in deep learning and AI is exciting you the most right now?
Man, it's where to start, right? I think, as sort of a founder in the space, or founders in the space, it's always a daily battle between trying to, dig deep into the next new thing, to read that next paper, to begin implementing another idea to improve the system, and then also just just kind of getting back to the basics, which, in our case is talking to customers and building product, right? So, but I mean, to answer your question without answering your question here, I think maybe areas where we're really paying attention to now is like, well, what does it mean that you have a 100K context window, right? What does that unlock? What new ways of actually helping out your set of customers can you do with this feature, right? And it could be a ton, right? To your point, maybe it is actually worth this like cost latency trade-off to, have a longer call, a more expensive call, but a more accurate one, right? I think that is probably the thing that's at least keeping me personally up at night right now.
Yeah, I like that point a lot too. Like I was very interested in like cross-encoder re-ranking. So that's like re-ranking search results with it, not a language, like an 80 million parameter. It's still slower. And yes, I think also in this new world, you're willing to wait longer. And that's a very interesting trend. Let me ask you two startup questions. So first of which is this thing you talk about talking to customers. I'm just curious on generally getting people's perspectives on your work, like working on a deep technical product. Do you think innovation comes from, the customers and seeing their use cases, or maybe like this kind of like reading the science? Like you're either like deeply in the science or you're at like the application layer and trying to see like what's the next thing to do from those two perspectives.
I mean, think for us, because we're sort of at the application layer, so directly like we're productizing something and putting it to use. So it's less of an infrastructure product. So here, I think what's been super successful for us is relationship management with customers, sort of just like classic, like be available, hold their hand, talk to them often, and kind of like ease them into deploying it. So that's been super important to us. Maybe less so than like very, very deep technical innovation. But I guess this depends on where you are in this, like sort of the stack. I guess if you go down one level to Weaviate, that's a little different.
And it's sort of
sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and it's sort of right. It's one of these. It's sort of one and the other. It's like it's totally true what Finn is saying. It's like spending time like deeply empathizing with customers to understand what problems are they actually hoping this stuff can solve. Like when you go past the cool Twitter demo or Loom recording or whatever. But at the same time, it is also such a new and fast moving space. So you do have to constantly pay attention to like what's happening in the science. You do have to like every single like, news blurb that comes out, like 100K content, you do need to contextualize that from the perspective of the customers for whom you're trying to solve a problem for.
Fascinating. I'd say maybe like to give a quick example from Weaviate, like the new, and this isn't like, I'm not like revealing private information. This is like something that we said on the podcast, like the group by filter that came from like a customer request as an example. But then like on the other end, like the research we're doing on disk ANN and like, kind of like the PQ stuff and filter disk ANN, if you go into the weeds of it, that's not really something that a customer would ask for because they don't think about vector indexes like to know what the like to tweak to make it different. So I think that's sort of that perspective of how I see the abstraction layers. And yeah, it's so super interesting. So then the second question I wanted to ask you, which with kind of like a startup question, you already hinted at it, is like the CRM, the trends in growing a community and a set of customers is like, do you think about like using the large language models to manage your sort of relationships with people? And are we seeing like a huge breakthrough in that?
Yeah, happy to take this. I mean, I think I'd like to think both Finn and I are kind of by this point quite like native with like all this stuff. I mean, most of our coding is done either with Kapa dogfooding it ourselves or off GPT-4 or Claude or whatever the latest model is. But this stuff, I think it's just old school relationship management still that kind of works. I mean, don't get me wrong. We're always trying like new launches, scouring product hunt. But I think, nothing beats sitting down, getting on a Zoom call, and actually talking to your customers.
Yeah, I agree fully with the value in doing that. I guess I just like something that I find really interesting, and this is kind of like the angle that we're taking with our generative feedback loop thing is like when a new blog post comes out or like, Weaviate 1.20 comes out, when we have this new set of features, is like going into the CRM and saying like, hey, you would like this because you worked on this, and the language model just does all of that. And then you just send.
I'm sure someone will build like an awesome like LLM native CRM. I'd love to use that tool. That
yeah, me too. Anyways, so Emil and Finn, guys, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I think this is such a great coverage. I mean, you guys are at the cutting edge of putting the documentation into these systems. I've used the Kappa, and it's awesome. So thumbs up on how well it works, and good luck with everything.
Thanks. Appreciate you having us on, Connor. Been a ton of fun.